Tongue-tied, I find myself forever affected by the mouths of Hegel and Jacques Derrida, mesmerized by the words that spill and resonate across the pages of Phenomenology of Spirit and Philosophy of Right, to Gla, Now Clang, and Life-Death. With my tongue, I sound out the depths of their respective philosophies, feeling their cultures cultivate the raised fungiform of my papilla, allowing the form of their thoughts to languish epiglottally above the windpipe, before luxating their semantic resonances with the vibration of dissonant vocal cords. Between Hegel and Derrida, I find mouths that speak to an undying commitment that I savor, a desire to loosen how sex and the body can be read or felt in art, philosophy, and literature. While many would not necessarily approach the formidable edifice of Hegelianism with the question of sex and mind, there is no dispute regarding the fact that the very movement of the Hegelian dialectic itself is profoundly sexual in nature. Sex for Hegel is fundamentally an issue of rationality, as corporeal and intellectual differences encountered within the family unit, the social arrangement he privileges in Philosophy of Right as a structure that must sublate such differences into the one sex of society, which he argues is therefore spirituality. Sexes in Hegelianism are always reduced to one sex by the unity of marriage, as a social formation that privileges not only male power, authority, and sexuality, but man's ability to affect himself, to stroke, caress, and filiate himself with the logic that he has cultivated from within. Man's ability to relate to himself, a capacity that Hegel explicitly denies of women, is an essential moment in the shaping of human spirit, in which the relation shared between father and son, the affective filiation of one man speaking to another, enables man to know himself through self-conscious unity with his offspring. Man conceives himself by producing a son, a living being that allows him to relate to himself as his own resource, a form of internal and external mediation which Hegel likens to the figure of a simple seed, a seed we will return to momentarily. So when I say that this paper is an attempt to loosen the rationalization of sex via the vocal cords, I mean to suggest that the problem lies with Hegel's appropriation of human speech as a privileged site for the autoaffection of the masculine subject, and the vehicle for hierarchalization of sex through the synthesis of contradictory ideas. What follows, then, is my attempt to loosen Hegel's rationalization of sex via Derrida, and the attention the latter gives in Gla to the differences that are secreted by the body in advance of sublation, as an acknowledgement of the autoaffection or self-touching that ripples throughout the body by way of the vocal cords prior to signification. A self-caressing or self-affecting of difference that no dialectical arrangement can arguably apprehend as such. Pure autoaffection, Derrida writes, in Speech and Phenomena, is the operation of hearing oneself speak, which in turn reduces the inward surface of one's body. It is the unmediated and pure experience of self-affirmation, the possibility of subjectivity, according to Derrida, that is established through the proximity of mouth and ear, and the presence that is cultivated with the self-affective touch or stroke of the human voice. Autoaffection, according to Derrida, is a form of time that does not borrow from outside of itself, that does not take from the world outside any substance of expression that is foreign to its own spontaneity. It is the element of ideality or universality in which the internal mediation of disparate ideas are pacified by the self-affective lapping of the rational mind with the tongue that vocalizes and soothes. Thus, consciousness, Derrida writes, is the experience of pure autoaffection, the self-affirmation and proclamation of human presence through the experience of hearing oneself speak as such. While Hegel's thesis on self-conscious certainty and sociality of spirit does not reflect a similar verbiage or articulation of the human voice as raised by Derrida and of grammatology, Hegel's privileging of man's ability to self-relate a feature he likens to the motif or concept of the seed in the lectures on the philosophy of history, bear striking resemblances to Derrida's critique of autoaffection, which, he ultimately suggests in Grammatology, is none other than the heteroaffection of the subject via discourse. As Hegel suggests in Lectures on the Philosophy of History, the manifestation of the seed or semen in nature as the moment for us in which the question of sex engages with rationality becomes a phenomenal substance par excellence for the sublation of life itself. Der Sem, or Samen, the German for seed, semen, sperm, or grain, in Hegelian logic, epitomizes the immediate, simple, and unreflective progress of spirit. As a spirit, Hegel writes, man does not have an immediate existence, but is essentially turned in upon himself. Since he possesses an ideal knowledge of reality, man ceases to be merely a natural being that is subservient to animal impulses or intuitions, and instead acts in accordance with ends and determines himself in the light of a general principle. Plants begin as seeds, Hegel tells us, but the seed, much like the spirit, is also the product of the plant's entire life, for it develops only in order to produce the seed. In other words, the seed does not go outside of itself for Hegel, nor does it not form a relation with the outside and its absolute other or opposite. Rather, the division between seed and plant, like son and father, is not absolute. Both become their own products of self-affection. The seed becomes the plant, which becomes the seed again, and the man becomes his own son, the son of his work from his own seed. Man conceives himself by producing a son, a living being that allows him to relate to himself as his own resource. This relation of father and son, glued together by the substantive feeling of familial love, enables man to know himself implicitly through his self-conscious unity with another and of the other with him, through the filiation of love that is shared between father and son in order to produce the same movement or shape of self-conscious certainty. What I'm trying to suggest here in referring to Hegel's motif of the seed as a way of explaining the shape of spirit as it develops through the filiation of father and son is that autoaffection is more than just the self-touching that takes place during the moment of hearing oneself speak. It is also the self-touching that takes place within the social formation of the family, in which the voice of the master of the household becomes a seed that germinates all forms of self-conscious certainty, the pure experience of internal mediation, which is in fact always a mediation through the voice of the Father on high. For Derrida, the problem remains as to how we can circumvent the absolute philosophical position of the Father in Hegelian logic and the prevailing assumption that the human voice spontaneously facilitates the autoaffection of the subject. This desire to reverse the auto-insemination of the Father's authority as it pertains to the human voice is borne out in Derrida's 1974 publication Glas, a work that, at its heart, aims to unstick the surety of presence that is cultivated in the ability to hear oneself speak. Glas, in its unconventional stylistic format, is an arrangement of two columns, the pedagogical philosophy of Hegel on the left and the erotic poeticism of Genet on the right, a coupling forged by Derrida himself to incite an outrageous complication of the dialectical method and the act of reading itself, which Geoffrey Bennington and David Wills describes in their translation of Glas as the littered space of species extinction, decay, disappearance, and death. If, as Derrida argues in Dissemination, Hegel's sublation is an idealized system that automatically reduces the difference between contradictions to a single homogeneous model of logic, which again refers to Hegel's metaphor of the seed or semen, then the irregular layout of Glas is an exercise in demonstrating what remains anterior and exterior to this process, of the differences that fall away as the remainders or excrement of Hegel's philosophical essentiality. This challenge to the seed or sperm of Hegelian dialectics, however, is not so straightforward. Derrida recognizes the strength and resilience of Hegelian logic in philosophy. its almost invincible and uncompromising status, and perhaps crucially for Derrida, the way that the dialectical method anticipates and incorporates the very notion of a possible counter-argument in advance of it being posed. It is for this reason in particular that Glas should not be considered a direct refutation of sublation, as doing so would cause it to fall victim to the same method it contests. If Hegel champions sublation as a pure porousness which continually unfolds the internal differences of a synthesized concept, then Derrida's Glas should be read as a poetic lubrication of difference rather than any sort of philosophical submersion. Between both columns, words secrete into the margins of the text, gliding across blank spaces before sticking loosely to unrelated sentences and contexts, only to then dissolve back once again. Unlike the seeds or sperm of Hegel, which would produce a plant or offspring that refers back to itself as its own resource, its origin as a flower or father, the experience of reading Glas is a much more slippery, lubricious, and elusive affair. From the first page, meaning escapes the masterful hold of language itself. Every word, it would seem, represents a flagrant disregard for linear argumentation, citational standards, and traditional academic rigor. Instead, the formulation of Glas exposes language to the undecidability of wordplay, puns, oral resonances, and textual interruptions, where the authority behind any system of meaning is placed under scrutiny. Glas, in this sense, can be read as a sexual poetics where the differences between words, rather than becoming subsumed by sublation, are in fact treated to the experience of an excretion, of oozing out of the body of a text as hybrid, flotsam, or dead bits of meaning, left behind by the vigor of two columns rubbing together. Derrida's decision in choosing Glas as the title for the final work is twofold. First, the French Glas refers to the event of a bell announcing an imminent death or funeral procession, registered as a clang, knell, peal, toll, or chime. Appearing on the front cover in modest typeset, the title Glas sounds a warning to prospective readers of an inevitable violence that language is about to incur across all of its inner pages. Between these two towering columns of text, Derrida writes in the right-hand Genet, is a blank space that would fit a bell. Swinging back and forth from Hegel to Genet, the eyes of the reader take up a pendulous motion, slowly building to the inevitable collision of disparate ideas, which threaten to disorientate the logical progression of the rational mind. This swinging motion of reading for Derrida is not an action or logical operation of negation, of negating an idea in the hopes that a higher understanding might suddenly strike. Instead, it is Derrida's attempt to take a proverbial hammer to Hegelian philosophy, to batter it around the ears, confound it, deafen it, deaden it, luxate it from the safety of its absolute idealism, separate it from itself, in order to describe and decry its comprehensive, rigorous structure. Between the two, the eyes of the reader becomes the clapper of a bell that swings and collides with the nonsensical body of a text, only to resonate throughout the logical mind as a death knell of language itself. The second reason for Derrida's choice in Glas as a title resides in its subversive gle effect, the phonemic stress of a glottal stop, a type of consonant sound that is produced during speech by the closing of the vocal cords before they are quickly reopened, wherein the air of the lungs is released with force. As Derrida himself explains during a rare aside where he confirms both the decision and intention behind the chosen title, what I'm trying to write, gle, is not just any structure whatsoever, a system of the signifier or the signified, a thesis or a novel, a poem, a law, a desire or a machine, but what passes more or less well through the rhythmic structure of an annulus. The gle of Glas itself is a glottal action, of closing off the circulation of resonances that calls to mind the sound of a gagging or retching. Mercilessly throttling the throat, gle mimics the sound of strangulation when it is performed or uttered, exposing the speaking subject to the thrill or fear of a gentle choking in the moment of vocalization. It can be heard as an audible gurgling that echoes from down below, as if someone were gurgling or suffocating on the intrusive arrival or extruded presentation of wet saliva, sperm, or milk. Gl itself, then, is not a word but a clang, what Derrida describes as an impression or feeling that is registered by the body as a vibration that starts up without warning and fades away before any rational determination or meaning can be attributed to its passing. The gl of gla is not a property of the tongue or throat. It does not belong to speech as such. Rather, it is an event, an encounter between muscle, skin, flesh, fluid, and mucus that hoists the tongue before the procedural work of sublating sound into meaning. In other words, gl is the sound of a gagging on the seed or sperm of Hegel's logic, where the mouthpiece that would provide the concept with meaning chokes on what remains anterior and exterior to the dialectical method, the living conditions that would cause language itself to be spoken or stopped in the very first instance. Between the flaps of mucosal tissue in the throat, words are lubricated, glued, melted, spewed, but always mediated by the threat of meaning being suffocated by the very operation on which it relies. Gl, Derrida writes in the Genet column, tears the body, sex, voice, and writing from the logic of consciousness and representation that guides the Hegelian dialectic. Gargling on the wet, thin layer of mucus which maintains the vocal cords as a source of speech production, Gl performs an angular slash of the opposition in the throat, a death effect that remarks the progressive and teleological work of sublation from within itself. This inner threat to the dialectical synthesis, this gl effect that obstructs the airway in order to produce a consonant sound, is not an unfolding of internal differences or becoming of ideas that results in the production of truth. Instead, gl manifests in advance of speech as an unconscious strangulation or choking, which exposes language, to borrow from Derrida elsewhere in The Gift of Death, to a frightful mystery, an indiscernible yet irrepressible secret that causes the speaking subject to physically tremble. In the moment before vocalization, prior to the production of an idea or thesis that would enter into the back and forth rationalization of the dialectical method, difference is secreted by the trembling of mucosal tissue. In a literal sense, it is secreted as a gliding movement of the tongue and wet vibration of the vocal cords, producing an agglutination of sounds and meanings that flow out of the mouth and into language. In a poetic sense, it is also secreted, exuded as a resonance or feeling that resists the finality of signification and dialectical synthesis, a stealthy, clandestine, or secretive force that causes the body to tremble in anticipation of the event. In the very instance that air is forced from the lungs following the fleeting suffocation of a glottal stop, difference ripples from within prior to signification, owing to the mechanical vibration of the vocal cords themselves, as a fleshy operation that remains unfathomable to the inner workings of the conscious mind. The glottal action of gl, in other words, secretes the body in advance of sublation and itself engendering of internal contradictions, concealed as what remains external to the comprehensive and logically rigorous structure of Hegel's absolute idealism. In other words, the gl of gla is the remainder of that which cannot be summed up by sublation, the differences that resist the procedural movements of Hegelian logic and its desire to gather, preserve, and homogenize. By attending to the phenomena of the glottal stop during speech in gla, Derrida is thus suggesting that autoaffection, that form of self-relation so precious to Hegel, is inherently an event where the body encounters the death of language itself. In our mouths, there is always a meeting of foreign tongues, a wrestling of multiple mouthpieces that jostle together in the act of touching, translating, and transforming ourselves and others, but which are always exposed to the violent interruption of death, decay, and self-demolition. If I was to sound out one final thing in this mouth right now, it is the gl of gla that frustrates the pure autoaffection of the father, whose tongue I find in my mouth so often, which I wrestle with lovingly, but also with menace. Thank you.